The MCU is somewhat of an anomaly within the context of the history of film. It's an interconnected tapestry of films that is both inviting to viewers and has inspired massive financial windfalls. But not unlike the comics the films are adapted from, there are very concrete and tangible pitfalls to long-term serialized superhero storytelling. To put it simply, orchestrating narrative escalation correctly is key to maintaining a superhero universe. That's easier said than done on the scale that Marvel's attempting to do it. When you have a universe built out of complete stories that act as building blocks in order to build a much larger narrative thread, it's vital to know where the moments of tension are and when they can be used to raise the stakes. From 1,000 feet up, not necessarily film to film, and conversely when those stakes need to be lowered. Every superhero story can't be the universe is ending, we have to stop Thanos. You need interstitial narratives to allow for character growth. This hierarchy is what makes the big moments so successful. You need to be able to play these stories off one another without making it a battle of one-upmanship. The MCU, however, has struggled with this concept at various points throughout its existence. Understandably. There's a tricky science to making the individual solo films feel important while you're in them, while still having them be a piece of a larger, much more important whole. To break it down, one of the issues in the early MCU films, which became a stereotype, was that in order to make the movies feel like it was important to the larger universe, it would end with a large aerial battle. These are the kinds of fatiguing idiosyncrasies that Marvel Comics has been dealing with for 80 years. They have numerous examples of when they read the tea leaves well and when they didn't. So how can the MCU avoid the same mistakes that those very Marvel comics made, especially post-Infinity Gauntlet? Infinity Gauntlet quickly became Marvel's prize jewel within its comic line. It was the defining cosmic crossover for the House of Ideas. And this is when comics were selling. Sure, Secret Wars existed and was a sales juggernaut, but Marvel didn't have a Crises on Infinite Earths until Jim Starlin and George Perez supplied them with a sweeping galactic epic on paper. It was loved by fans, generated loads of cash, and put Marvel Comics on the map in 1991. Well, in a bigger, more crossover-ish way. Despite some development issues, Infinity Gauntlet was a modern classic within comics, the likes of which the Marvel Universe hadn't seen previously. Much like the MCU adaptation, Infinity Gauntlet sees Thanos constructing the ultimate weapon in order to wreak havoc across space and time. Unlike the films, he does this to prove his undying love to the concept of death, as opposed to attempting to balance the population of the universe, because that would have been unbelievably silly and shifted the tone of these films dramatically. But anyways, the book comes out, it's a huge success, so where does Marvel go from there? How do they top this truly epic run within comic books? They make the obvious move. They put a rushed sequel into production. In fact, instead of just doing one sequel, they do two. The Infinity War was released in 1992, and the Infinity Crusade released in 1993. Infinity Gauntlet felt like a story that had been worked on for a decade, well thought out, intricate in its plot and character development, and Infinity Crusade and Infinity War felt like quick comic book cash grabs, because that's what they were. See, here is a big lesson immediately for the MCU to learn. When you have a massive juggernaut culture-defining success, don't take an iterative approach to story, take a divergent one. Do something different. De-escalate the narrative. You've killed half the Avengers. You brought them back to life. What's left to do? Introduce new characters, introduce new threats, and introduce interesting and unique new status quos. Which thankfully, that's exactly what Kevin Feige and the rest of the MCU head honchos are currently doing. Phase 4 looks chock to the brim with new characters and new adventures that have nothing at all to do with Thanos or the core Avengers at all that were set up in Phase 1. But that doesn't mean it's the only pitfall. Going back to Marvel Comics, the biggest problem area for Marvel that's almost one-to-one with the MCU is not valuing creators and letting them leave because of a lack of respect and a lack of investment. James Gunn, Edward Norton, Terrence Howard, and Kenneth Branagh have all walked away from Marvel for different and varying reasons, to be clear. Did Joe and Anthony Russo leave the MCU because they were offered money by a Chinese investment firm in order to start their own studio? Yes, but the MCU needs its core brain trust to keep the quality high and characters' voices intact. So should Marvel have fought for any or all of these people? Maybe, maybe not. For those who are unaware, in the 1990s, Marvel Comics was a big money business. So much so that a single issue would sometimes net the creators millions of dollars in royalties. This spawned negotiations for character, partial ownership, and increased royalties with some of the company's top talent. Creators like Todd McFarlane, Mark Silvestri, and others all felt underappreciated by the company and decided to go out and start their own comic book companies. The parallels between them and the Russo brothers are pretty clear. Are there more directors and writers currently in the Marvel system that will soon jump ship to form their own enterprises, or just work elsewhere? Probably. What's important is that Marvel Studios treat those people well. Bleeding talent is the #1 reason that Too Big to Fail becomes small enough to do so. And Marvel has started to see some turnover. But another one of the main issues at the center of interconnected comic book universes is the fact that the storytelling tropes associated with them have become so easily recognizable that they telegraph the rest of the story to the audience. Specifically, for instance, the idea that characters could be killed off in order to raise the narrative stakes. Marvel Comics has killed Spider-Man multiple times, Doctor Doom, most of the X-Men, and even killed Galactus. And they've all come back. The audience understands that these characters are coming back to life eventually. They're highly valuable intellectual property. People are smart enough to understand this. And this is a major issue both in the comics and the MCU. How many times has Loki been murdered? How many times have they faked Nick Fury's death? These repeated tropes lessen the viability of actual status quo change and lessen the impact of potential decisions made by writers and directors. Therefore, you hit a point where if you're actually going to kill someone, actually kill them. And not just because of a Fox dispute like Quicksilver, kill them because there's a good narrative reason to do so and make it pay off. Don't retcon it. And this kind of comes down to maybe the biggest issue. And it's a semi-constant one across the board for both of these things. But especially in comic books, it's crossover fatigue or just fatigue in general. Comic book readers are always being forced to buy tie-in books, crossover books, and event specials in order to read a full story. With the MCU pushing out into TV, animation, and more feature films, the parallels here are 1-to-1. It's a lot to ask people to have seen 23 movies ahead of Infinity War. Now we need to also have a Disney Plus subscription and a Hulu subscription? And the time to watch those things? It's arguably the most pervasive issue facing the MCU. Marvel Comics and DC Comics have both suffered from repressive house styles. During the late 80s and early 90s, Todd McFarlane was repeatedly told by Marvel editorial to stop drawing Spider-Man's webs in such an overly dramatic way. In the 70s, DC editorial hired Curt Swan to redraw all of Jack Kirby's Superman faces on the Superpowers and Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen titles. That same thing happens with Marvel films. Creative intent is sanded down by attempts at emulating what has already worked in the past. Humor passes on the scripts are required these days, leaving all the characters the same level of quote-unquote jokey. The universe is filled with 15 different types of people that all have that Joss Whedon-esque bounce vocal pitter-batter, and it's happening visually as well. Here's a crazy idea. Imagine if Marvel made a single movie without all the jokes. Almost as though not every one of the films at this point needs to carry the same tone. Pretty crazy idea, right? From a visual standpoint, like I mentioned, the films have a restrictively cohesive visual aesthetic at this point. The same fight choreography teams work on almost all the films, the same approach to color correction is used, and the same over-reliance on green screen and CGI fixes become ubiquitous across the board. It takes a lot to have a Marvel movie stand out visually. For every Thor Ragnarok, you have 3 or 4 Ant-Man and the Wasps. Managing tone is arguably something that comics were doing better and still are doing better than the MCU is at this point. Look, the reality is that Marvel Studios has still been extremely intelligent in their approach to building a cinematic universe. They practically invented the modern popularized version of the idea. They are arguably the first people to accurately combine multiple film franchises into a single cohesive world since the Universal Monsters in the late 1930s. And they have taken a large amount of that success from looking at the Marvel comic book approach to storytelling in detail. They pulled the best and brightest characters, the most interesting storylines, and the most dynamic visuals directly from the books themselves. So now the question remains, will they roll in onto themselves now that they've become successful, or will they have the foresight to continue to learn new but existing lessons from Marvel editorial, from those very comic books? Will they attempt to rush out too much content too quickly? Will they attempt to repeat the success of Avengers Infinity War and Endgame too soon? Will they finally kill a character and have them stay dead for a good reason? All questions will have to wait to see answered. But the point is that art is not all that dissimilar to really any other job. There's always someone or something there to learn from. There's always a way to make sure history doesn't repeat itself, even if what you're looking at doesn't look quite like the thing you're doing. Marvel can learn the same way that all good artists should and do. The MCU will remain in good hands. Art is always about growth. The MCU should be no different. Martin Scorsese's comments and all. Well guys, that's it for today's episode of Nerdstalgic. If you enjoyed this one, press the like button down below. If you haven't yet done so, also hit subscribe. That way you won't miss anything that comes out on this channel. And hopefully there's 2 more videos on your screen right now. You click on either of those to stay right here, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video.